Hey everyone, welcome to the Them Before Us podcast. I'm your host, Jenn Friesen, and today we are having another fun conversation with a friend who runs another podcast, not necessarily an organization, but a podcast called Dads in Autism Land. His name is Mark DeGrasse. Mark, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me. Very excited.
So on the Dads in Autism Land podcast, Mark shares his real world experiences, both the struggles and the victories, while offering raw, honest, and relatable insights into fatherhood. He understands the emotional weight and uncertainty and sheer love that come with parenting a child on the spectrum, while making sure his other child's needs and ambitions are nurtured as well. And Mark both shares advice just from his life and then interviews other folks, other dads who are in the same boat. And so there will be a lot of, I'm sure, kind of child-centric, why do dads matter? Why does marriage matter? Things as we ebb and flow in the conversation. But I'd love to hear, Mark, just as you start, maybe share just a little bit about your family, about your sons, and then just kind of track us to where you are today. What made you want to do a podcast and encourage and interview other parents?
Sure. It was actually an idea my wife had back in January, and I was kind of, I do branding and marketing, so setting up different media channels is pretty easy for me. And my wife had an idea during church. She's like, "Hey, you should do a podcast just about being an autism father." And I was like, "Oh yeah, I could do that. We'll just set it up really quick. If it's somebody wants to hear it, great. We'll see." And it kind of just took off like right out the bat. We had like a ton of downloads, and what I found was that there's this huge community of dads specifically that were kind of alienated. I think as dads, especially if you have a severely autistic son, which I'll explain that in a second, you end up kind of you're kind of backup where mom takes the lead. She's the one setting up the appointments. She's the one going through a lot of the technical aspects of the journey. And as a dad, you're kind of like, well, I don't need attention. I don't need help. Like, you're the one doing the work. I just want to support you. But what I found was that, there is a group of men that are very dedicated to the task of raising their autism kids. And largely we're just unaddressed because, we're not the primary. But it's been fantastic. So just to start that, I have two sons, Damien and Declan. Damien's 12. He's severely autistic, nonverbal. Probably has the mentality of a 2 or 3 year old child, but he's 12 and 175 pounds. So there's some unique challenges with that. And then my younger son, who's only 10 months younger, is Declan, and he's very gifted, but also very dedicated. He's kind of a perfectionist, which has its own challenges. So balancing those two aspects has always been important to me and my wife, because we know how much attention our son with autism has. So it's been a balancing act to say, hey, both of you are just as important to us. And so we try to dedicate just as much time to him, which, is also a challenge because it's a lot of work. But, having the podcast, I've been able to connect with a lot of other dads that are going through the same thing. So the balancing of, the severe special needs and the, parenting a neurotypical child is its own challenge, but it's been a fantastic journey. And I've actually think I've become a much better person because of it. So I like to expose that to people and also just support the dads out there that are going through some hardships.
Yeah, that's really good. There was an article someone wrote a long time ago. So I was sharing with Mark a little bit outside of the show, and some people know that I worked with kids with special needs in my previous job for about 10 years doing Christian ministry and camping. And so we got a really fun side of hanging out with friends with special needs versus more of like education or the, like medical and things like that, which I think could be fun in their own right. But we definitely had a lot of fun. We just went to summer camp and things like that. But there was an article a woman wrote about having a baby and then learning that they have a diagnosis of having some kind of special needs. She equated to having planned a trip to Paris and ending up in Holland. I don't know if you ever heard that one. And she talked about,
I actually had it on my podcast.
No, that's awesome. Yeah. So anyway, she just says, you go through the whole thing. You're reading all the Paris books, you're practicing French, you're looking up all the places you're going to go. You have all these big grand dreams, and you're going to Paris. And all of a sudden you realize, no, you're actually going to Holland. And you feel a lot of I'm not really prepared. I have to totally switch my thoughts and processes to like, now what am I like? What am I doing when I'm in Holland? What things should I look up? What's the language I need? But I like that she says it's not that Holland is worse than Paris. It's not that I hate Holland. I would give anything if I could just go to Paris instead. But it is a huge adjustment. And there is a grieving of when you picture having a baby, and I'm just praying it's healthy and he or she is healthy, and things happen that are really challenging. There can be grief there, but there can be joy there, and you learn. Can you just tell our audience a little bit, maybe for you and your wife, and this was your first child, so you had expectations of, I'm going to be a dad, this is what it's going to look like. What was it like to have those expectations kind of shift over time?
You know what? It's funny because I never really had expectations of fatherhood. I knew that I'd probably have kids one day, and I'll just kind of cross that bridge when I get to it. So it wasn't super surprising. I am Christian, so I think that God places us in the greatest opportunities for learning. And so for me personally, I guess that was having an autistic son, and I kind of call both of them miracle children, because they weren't really planned for. But if we'd found out that my first son was autistic, we probably wouldn't have had my second son, and we had him immediately. So he was actually born before my first son started showing autism symptoms. And if he wasn't, though, we probably wouldn't have had the second one. So I tend to just, approach things as they come. And so when I found out, and I was, and actually a lot of the dads I talked to have the same reasoning, where it's kind of like, I didn't see the autism initially. I was like, well, he's just different. He might be slower, but he'll pick it up eventually. But my wife was very on top of it. Probably within like 18 months, he started showing, he had regressions, because he had said a couple words and then he stopped saying those words, and then he started getting really lethargic. And then by like 18 months, he was like a different person essentially than he was as a baby. So that was some adjustments. And then you go through the stress of the diagnosis, and what is it, maybe he just can't hear, maybe he's deaf, and so we had to go through the deaf. And then if you do think it's autism, we had to go through the elimination of everything else. Like, okay, it's not Fragile X, it's not some speech deficit, it's none of those things. And so then you get the autism diagnosis. And I'm not sure how it is now. That was 10 years ago now. But it was a process. And throughout that entire process, you're wondering if you're doing things wrong. Could we have done something differently? Did we do something to cause this? And a lot of self-blame. And so it was, it is a difficult path. And then, but really what solved my issue of not denial, but skepticism about autism was my second son, because my second son was neurotypical. And so we saw the development differences, and it was like, okay, Damien's development was much different than Declan's. And so that, I think that helped me personally accept it sooner than I've seen some other dads. But once we were on board, I'm kind of like, okay, here's the situation. How do we move forward, and how do we keep living? And like I said, my wife was very active, and so she was driving the thing forward, and I took the role as like, okay, well, I'm going to support this, and I'm going to do everything I can to learn about it, and then just take action is the easiest thing for me. I had gone through many years of, and this is just my whole life, of depression caused by kind of undiagnosed IBS is what I call it now, where I was basically nauseous and in a certain amount of pain for every moment of my life for about 25 years. And so now, and I figured that out about 3 years ago. And since then, I'm kind of like, well, life's pretty good.
Wow.
I'm
Yeah.
not in pain.
Wow. That's incredible. Well, and can you tell, so, them before us, our big thing, children's rights first, what children's perspective first, always. And, within the community of the special needs community, meaning family, extended family, divorce, which is something we talk about at them before us, is really high. And people can imagine, there's so many challenges that go into it. And then you put on top of it that a lot of parents are trying to do it kind of on their own, or you're shuffling kids back and forth. It just can be so complicated. But can you just share with us maybe a little bit your experience with the challenges, and how you and your wife have navigated them? And maybe even just from interviewing other folks, what anecdotally have you heard or picked up on that kind of help us understand the challenges of that for people's marriages?
Yeah, a lot of the dads I talk to are still married, and it's the consistent thing I've said is kind of like the mutual engagement of the situation, where it's like, hey, we're both in this, we're on the same team, and we're going to get through this together, even if it is extremely difficult. And probably up until Damien was probably 8 years old, it was a 24/7 job, and what we had, because we had about 3 years where neither one of us really slept. It was like we'd have to trade off, like, okay, it's your turn tonight, and then we wouldn't negotiate, but we'd say, what do you need, and then we try to accommodate the other, which I think that's the key, where it's accepting the situation, and then it's taking kind of mutual responsibility of it, and just running support for each other. If you don't have that, and I think sometimes, especially when you're in the thick of it, where it's maybe 24/7, you're having to pay attention to the situation. The divorce looks like, hey, I'd only have to deal with the situation 50% of the time, maybe, and that's maybe for some people it's 100% of the time you don't have to deal with it. But that's the temptation, where it's like, maybe it would be easier if we both just had some time off sometimes. And yes, it's sad that it didn't work out and we had to separate the family, but at least we get half of the time you're not full time doing this. But I think that still just leads to other complications in your life, where, okay, you do get remarried. Okay, now you have more children, and potentially more autistic children. And then you also have this autistic child over here. So I don't think it really helps the situation. And honestly, it could always be tough. But for us, like, we found respite. We actually started attending the church we attend, called the Ridge in Austin, because they had an embrace program where essentially they had one-on-one attention for your child, and it was specifically for special needs. And so just that hour per week was a blessing. And then we found things like camp, which is a camp they hold in Central Texas, again, respite for special needs families, and that was helpful. And then we started going to Central Texas Autism Center, full-time ABA therapy, and then that was even better. And so things have gradually improved over time, and I think our acceptance of the situation was key, and then working as a team, and understanding that it is completely different than what you were used to. You say, like, oh, kids change things, but special needs kids massively change things, where you've gone from living your own life to not only caring for other people full time, but having that care being unconventional and even more intensive than usual. But with all that said, sometimes Damien's a blessing in a lot of ways. He's a happy guy. It's amazing the things that he could just be satisfied with in his life. And I use that as an example for myself, where it's like, man, I think I need some super complicated situation to be satisfied with my life. And now I look at it as like, no, I just need quiet sometimes. Like, that's enough to be happy. And so it's difficult, but again, it's a blessing in a lot of ways too.
Mm-hmm. It's really good. We talk a lot about gender difference in the home, that a child does best when raised by their mother and father, in large part because men and women parent differently. They see situations differently. You talked about that a little bit, talking about women tend to be the one that are kind of organizing the things, and I'm making the appointments, and I'm kind of getting us where we need to go on time, and all these things. And maybe that leads, kind of like you were saying, I just wonder sometimes too if dads might feel like, hey, in addition to all this pressure and marriage isn't what it used to be, I also don't feel that engaged with what's going on, so it doesn't matter that much if we sort of split up. And like you're saying, if both people really see it as this is a partnership and we are working together, maybe that helps it not feel so burdensome on all the appointments, all that stuff feel burdensome just on one person. But can you tell us some ways, because we can think about it with typical kids, typically developing kids, that there might be some gender difference things that are really important. But have you noticed anything in particular, maybe unique, between your two sons, where your interactions with your son who's on the spectrum versus your wife's really make a big difference, and how, and like you working together makes a big difference for him in a little different way than your other son?
Yeah, it's it's kind of interesting, because some of the roles are just super obvious. It's kind of like they say, the mom is supposed to be the nurturing side and the caregiver, whereas dad, kind of a role is to toughen you up a little bit, and that is mom's role sometimes too. But I think our role specifically is that aspect, and we fit it. I play with the boys. I roughhouse and we have fun. And I think they kind of expect that, like, oh, dad's the fun, goofy guy, versus mom, you go to for care. And you know some she's good at discipline too, but I take that role as well, where you have to give that masculine side. And as much as society sometimes these days likes to demonize that as like, oh, everything masculine is bad, while also encouraging women to be more masculine, which is ironic. But I think we kind of fit into those roles. And as the boys have gone bigger, and my son, Damien, he's 175 pounds at 12. He's probably going to be, I'm 200 pounds and 6'2". He's probably going to be 300 pounds and like 6'5". And so I'm the only one at this point that could actually handle him physically. So it's almost like more of a demand than you may have in a neurotypical child, where my other son, Declan, he is getting bigger. But and even for him, they're both about as tall as mom. So we're having to establish those kind of physical differences as well. And it's kind of easier because it's not a philosophical debate. It's just like, here's this situation. I'm physically able to handle this situation where she might not be able to anymore. And so some of those roles are kind of switching and going back and forth. I don't know if that answers your question, but I think it's acceptance of the situation, the actual situation, not the idealized version that we would love to have, but like, no, this is just what we're dealing with. Allows us to go to those roles that are better for us as they get older.
Yeah, that's good. It makes me think there's a lot of the wrestling that dads do with their kids, but particularly the boys, is teaching them, that there is a temperance that has to go along with your strength. Like, dad could launch you across the room if you got mad, or if you are fighting too hard, or the kid bites you or something. It's like, okay, now we're done. Like, you're not allowed to do that. So they're always butting up against boundary, and understanding that, like, yeah, it's good to roughhouse and play, but you do that differently with different people. You can't, shove your little sibling across the room.
Mm-hmm.
But that seems like it would be even more important with, well, especially you've described now that maybe mentally he's a lot younger. So he has the body of growing into an adult, but then doesn't have the sort of capacity to like regulate how strong you are. So you don't just like snap somebody in two if he doesn't have you teaching him what that looks like, or like really strict boundaries. And mom is only going to be able to do it for a little bit in a certain way to a certain height, Yeah. So that's really interesting.
No, and for Damien specifically, like, we knew he was going to be big. He's always been on the, high percentile in terms of size and weight. And so we're like, you have to picture it like, if it's not appropriate for somebody to do when they're 18, then it's not appropriate for them to do when they're 5. And that might look, like, keep your pants on when you go outside. It sounds like, oh, it's so funny, he took his pants off. It's not going to be funny when you have an 18-year-old, 300-pound linebacker. Oh, he took his pants off. Like, nope. We
when you
gotta
get in
get
trouble,
that fixed now.
like legal trouble and stuff, a lot of friends with special needs, because they don't understand different things that are going on. We talked about that a lot, like even helping understand, it's not appropriate to hug everybody. Like you're saying, you do a high five, you do a handshake, when you're saying hi to girls, like teaching them how to be appropriate, because you like you're saying, you need to think about what they're doing at 40 years old, walking around the community more by themselves, and just, oh yeah, it's so cute when they're like, oh, he like whacked me or whatever. I was like, no.
Yeah.
Not
Well,
cute.
then you think like he doesn't understand language a lot of the time. So if there was, say, a police officer like, stop right there, and he doesn't stop, then you start getting into really scary situations. So we've always kind of kept that mindset where, what's going to be safe for everybody involved, and how's he going to survive, which is always, a big concern.
Yeah, for sure. What advice do you have for those ways to focus on your children that then do not have the extra needs or the extra special needs, to make them feel valued, to make them feel seen, even though they're not getting maybe the 24-hour kind of attention that other kids require?
No, that's a great question. And we thought about that too, right from the beginning, because we're like, man, Damien's taking up a lot of our time, a lot of our attention, a lot of our energy, just physically. It takes a lot more energy. And my wife has been fantastic about that. So it's, it's really, Damien, we enrolled in Central Texas Autism Center. And so we said, hey, if we're spending this much money for his schooling, technically, then we should do the same thing for our other child. So we enrolled Declan in Regents, which is a Christian classical education school here in Austin. And then also sign him up for the sports that he wants to do. And, just make sure that he's also just as active, because he's seen what we're doing with Damien. Oh, Damien, before we went to the Central Texas Autism Center, we were at 5 or 6 different therapists, constantly driving around to get him to the places. And we're like, well, we don't want him resenting his brother, because honestly, when we're not around, like, this is his family, his other brother. So we can't have his other brother resenting him. We want to make sure that he understands, his role, but also his individuality. Like, it's not like you're just around to take care of your brother. We want to be like, no, we want you to have your own life. We're going to, help you out with that as much as we can for as long as we can. But ideally, we would be with you, because we decided that we never wanted to see him in a home, just because he is nonverbal. And we had issues in the past where that led to, issues where he can't protect himself. He can't argue his case. So it's more intensive. So we have tried to, my other son is on a select baseball team, which, if you know anything about club baseball, you're like, that's a full-time job too. So it's a lot of work, but honestly, I think that it's our responsibility to make sure that they are raised in a way that makes them as productive and helpful as possible. And even with Damien, because since having my podcast, I talked to a dad whose son was severely autistic, nonverbal, just like mine, and ended up with a job at a hotel. So even that, I'm like, okay, well, this is hopeful. Like, maybe there is a place out there for him to contribute back to society. But if nothing else, I see my other son is much more empathetic. He's excellent with special needs kids. He's excellent with young children. And I think a lot has been added to his life just from, being part of our special needs family.
Yeah, that's awesome. You mentioned the idea kind of that culture really it's kind of in an effort to elevate women to, maybe there was a point where men were elevated and women were really pushed down. I mean, you look at cultures around the world right now, that's still happening, but sort of in an effort to elevate women and, we need rights. It's like really needed to push men, like act like men are trash and toxic the only kind of masculinity is toxic masculinity. Yeah. Can you just speak a little bit to maybe sort of your picture, or what you would say is like, what makes good men, what makes good husbands and fathers? Like, what are those qualities? Why do you think that's so important to kind of talk about and elevate in society?
Yeah, I take a lot of times a biblical perspective, maybe a progressive biblical perspective, because some of the stuff, you see in like the Old Testament, you're like, wow, it sounds pretty harsh right there. But I do think we have, to be a good man, it's really, it's caring for your family. I do believe that it is the man's role to be, the spiritual center. Like, it's our job to say, we're going to church and we're following the Bible and we're, adhering to these rules of a greater power that's beyond us. And that actually makes the job a little bit easier, because there are a lot of aspects of the Bible that you could adhere to yourself. Not sinning, it sounds like an easy directive, but if you actually look at the commandments and things like that, adhering to them is pretty difficult, and most likely you're going to fail all the times. But if you don't try at all, then you're definitely going to fail. So I think, my role is to be an example of, here's what it means to live a godly life. Here's what it means to attempt to be Christ-like. And that could be as simple as, encouraging good habits, taking care of your family, loving your wife, no matter what, and trying to make your relationship and your marriage be an example to your children, to say, here's what it means to care for the family and provide, and give them the things that they need to grow. So I think that's nothing I've said is easy. And in a lot of ways, I still fail all the time. But I think my attempt to be like that shows. And so over the last 3-4 years, specifically, I've gone through a big, mental, spiritual, and physical transformation. And for a lot of it, I felt like, man, am I being selfish by trying to improve myself in order to provide better for my family? Like, is this just all for me? And what I came up with was that it still wasn't about me, because it was, working on the future version of me that should hopefully be able to provide better and do better. And even in the process of trying to improve myself, I'm able to show my son Declan primarily, like, hey, here's what's possible if you just decide to be better. And also for my wife to say, hey, I'm willing to go through the sacrifices that I've made. And a lot of times it could be as simple as giving up drinking. Let's say that because you're in this hardship and because things are difficult, like, oh, I have a drink every so often, but a lot of times that's just a crutch or an avoidance of what you should be feeling in this moment, and then that just numbs your ability to react properly to it. So giving up those things, like I said, I had dietary issues, and so I had to give up beef and pork and eggs and a number of vegetables and fruits and all that kind of stuff. So my crutch was mainly food, where I was like, oh yeah, food's great. Like, I could always feel happier eating, and I had to give that up, and then a bunch of other things. So I think my role is as exemplifying what's possible with sacrifice. Hopefully has made a difference, and my family's pretty happy, so I think it's working.
Yeah. Well, and then kind of as the final thought, what would you say to encourage, if there's young men who are, marriage is not looking popular right now. It might feel scary. Our culture doesn't talk about it. I've talked on other podcasts and conversations about the 50% divorce rate is actually a lie. That's kind of old news. It's not that bad, though. A lot of people just aren't getting married anymore. They're cohabitating. They're doing these other things. But if there's young men listening who are like, oh man, well, what you're describing actually sounds quite hard. I don't know why I would want to do that. I kind of am enjoying my life doing whatever now. Or they're looking around and like thinking there's no women that have the values alignment or whatever. What would you say to just young men they're like, maybe I'd get married someday. I'll wait 10 years. Or they want to get married now, but they're kind of like, this sounds scary. I don't know if I could do it.
You know what? It's funny because I always tell people, because I see that. I know guys who are like, even if they are married, they're like, I'm never having children. And I think they're missing out on probably the biggest opportunity ever for improvement. And that's, that's not everybody's cup of tea. And maybe they are satisfied being alone and doing their own thing. But personally, I don't think you could reach a real level of manhood without having children. It's just not possible. What children are to me is the greatest project of your entire life. It is, giving the responsibility of making another person, and it's live, like it's dynamic, and you don't know what you're going to get when you go through this process, and it forces you into growth that just wouldn't have been necessary had you not gone through this. Now that might be like, oh, it's selfish, you're just doing this as a project. It's like, no, this is a manifestation of your entire life, is creating another life, and you're doing it with somebody else, which also requires a ton of coordination. And honestly, you could think that, oh, I have everything I need. You don't know that. You haven't experienced everything. How could you possibly make that decision? That's pretty arrogant of you to think that you've made it just because you decided that. How does that work? And again, I have a pretty different perspective of that. And I don't, pain's necessary for growth as far as I'm concerned, and pain, and that doesn't mean physical pain all the time, but a shift in your mindset, and that's supposed to be there. That's what we're here for, as far as I'm concerned, is to grow as much as possible, to learn as much as possible. And I just don't see how you could get that without going through this. Not that you can't, because I don't know what that situation is, but personally, before I had kids and before I was married, you just have no idea what it's like. And I think it is, the most, godly thing you can do. And according to the Bible, that's our job, is to multiply. So there you go.
Yeah. Well, it sounds more like it's the grand kind of adventure of life. And I think a lot of men do feel kind of aimless. Like, where is there adventure to be had anymore? There isn't as much of like, go west, young man. Like, nobody's ever been there. Build a house, get a settlement or whatever. But what you're describing is quite an incredible adventure. And you have to think, actually helping craft the life of other human beings that go on after you die. it's the only thing in a sense that really goes on after we die is, kind of some genetic material, maybe, unless you're really smart and famous and people care about your ideas or your books or something. So it's a pretty exciting thing. Well, wrapping up, Mark, where can people find you, or there's anything you're working on or passionate about that you just love people to know before we kind of sign off?
Sure. I got a bunch of stuff going on. If you go to my personal website, markdegrasse.com, I put a lot of my content there. And then dadsandautismland.com. If you are an autistic father or just any kind of special needs family, it's really good. But, especially because there are a lot of resources for moms. My wife actually has a nonprofit called Special with the Side of Mom, and it's one of many. And so if you are a dad that feels kind of alone, feels like, there's you don't deserve help because you're not taking the brunt of the work, then you'll find a lot to learn with Dads in Autism Land. So definitely check that.
Awesome. Well, Mark, thanks so much for all your work, and thanks for joining the Them Before Us podcast today.
Thank you. It's been fun.
Everyone, we hope you enjoyed this conversation. Thanks so much for joining the Them Before Us movement.